All right, Andre, I think we are good to go.
Do you want to kick it off?
Yeah, for sure. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar that Silverfort is doing together with Microsoft around extending MFA to all of the blind spots across your organization. My name is Jonathan. I'm from Silverfort, and today presenting with me, we have Andre Luterman from Microsoft. Andre will kick us off, and then he will pass it over to me. Just some housekeeping, you guys are muted, so please note that. If you want to ask any questions, please use the Q&A function in the Teams meeting to ask any of your questions, and we will get to those throughout the session today. If you want to deep dive into any topics that we mentioned, please type those in as well, and based on the time, we will try and get into all of those, and any subject that we don't have time to cover in today's webinar, we will make sure to follow up with one-on-one offline. So with that, Andre, I will kick it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. So my name is Andre Luterman. I'm a technical specialist with Microsoft in the realm of cybersecurity. I'm also part of the CTO office of Microsoft Germany. And I would like to give you a little intro on how to secure identities in the modern world and how we can extend that in a certain way to all the blind spots within your organization. So we used to do for more than 20 years a typical system and a typical perimeter-based network approach with our Active Directory being on-prem. And that was the central identity system then. We once logged in, makes sense from a single sign-on perspective, it's easy to use as well, and had access to every resource, no question about that. That has changed a little bit from the central identity system because it's also in some degree a problem, I would say, because if you just have taken over one identity once, you probably have access to all the resources anyway internally. Well, with the adoption of cloud or hybrid models as well, and embracing maybe also a multi-cloud journey to a certain extent, the identity has become the new parameter because there has not been any kind of firewall, anything between us and the world somewhere in the internet as well. But we still would depend, and we also at Microsoft acknowledge that there will still be an on-prem world existing for the next 10, 20 years anyway. The question for us here, a single compromised user in this regard, in any regard, can lead to a business shutdown. So we know that the weak spot where we attacked on is typically the on-prem Active Directory still. And there has been lots of modern safeguards on the M365 and Azure Active Directory world that can be used to fortify your identity posture to a certain degree. If we look into some of the data points that we publish in our recent digital defense report, where things go wrong, we're not using any kind of security solution in the realm, we still that lots of account breaches are still based on password-based attacks. That's not that much a case in the M365 or Azure AD world, I would say, to this regard, because legacy authentication has been deactivated and there's not much posture. But most of the incidents here can be traced back just to few missing elements and could be addressed through modern security approaches in the same way that they could be adopted in the modern security that is based on what we can do in M365 and Azure. Well, one of the main safeguards, and you can definitely bring down lots of your posture if you use modern approaches to MFA. We know about certain attack vectors that try to do MFA fatigue, just spamming you with MFA requests, but this can also be mitigated with the right setup, and we have lots of resources on how to do right setup for MFA in our realm as well. But we still see that only 26% since 2019 have really adopted an MFA approach for their accounts yet. So that means more or less 74% of all users are still not using any kind of second factor. And I definitely would recommend to do something like that in the modern world. We also see that lots of our investigations with customers that are not using any kind of our stack yet during some kind of ransomware recovery engagement are based or revealed that legacy authentication methods on-prem are still enabled. And my all-time favorite here is LDAP SimpleMind, which is just a clear text protocol more or less and used by legacy applications. Everybody on the network that has the possibility to look into the stream here can see username and password. So there is some posture there as well. So the challenges with securing identities are sometimes seen from the outside world, like there is an on-premises and there is a cloud identity. We would say that is actually one thing. So they are coming together. It's the same thing because you sync your on-prem identities to the cloud world as well to a certain degree. And we would say there has to be some kind of an end-to-end solution on how to safeguard and secure identities in both worlds. It's actually one world, I would say. Another factor here is that we often forget that identity aren't just humans. There are service principals, service accounts in everywhere as well, in legacy applications as well. So they have their own user base or maybe their own user model as well, if they aren't connected to any kind of Active Directory. So how can we establish baselines for prevention? That's typically done as well with some basic hardening. But after that, things like identity protection or multi-factor authentication, conditional access are coming into place. So we would say we would like to extend the same safeguards that we have for our cloud platforms to the legacy on-prem apps in the on-prem world as well. With that, we would like to embrace modern security approaches, and Microsoft is one of the only vendors that still cares about on-prem, hybrid, and multi-cloud as well. And you have to think about how to embrace the zero trust principles here. Microsoft can also help you with all the 6 pillars inside the zero trust world, but partners like Silverfort here are definitely on the forefront in this regard to securing or integrating the on-prem and legacy apps into this kind of approach. So the basic principles here are assume breach, use least privileged access, but the main principle here, for example, is never trust, always verify. So verify every access instead of just logging in once and having access to everything. Holistic identity protection, one of the main features in Azure Active Directory, for example, is identity protection conditional access. That is very well regarded to, and we have the possibility also to easily integrate MFA with that. We can definitely detect anomalies in behavior towards any kind of SaaS app with Defender for Cloud apps. And there's Defender for Identity to monitor and recognize any kind of compromised accounts and the attack timeline of that. But this is an after effect detection, I would say. So there's what about prevention in the first place? So meaning, why think about some kind of attack vector when you can prevent it in an earlier step already? And I won't control my users, but any kind of access to any kind of data, depending on the sensitivity of the app or the data, in a certain way. So if I have a user here on my left side, for example, it's a sales manager or sales account rep in my example here. He's accessing, he's based in London. He has a mobile client here, and he's now accessing some kind of my organization's apps from London, UK. Last sign-in was some hours ago. We can check with every kind of access here. Where is he accessing from? Is it really the user? Is it the device that we know of? Is that device fully patched? Is it managed? And where has it been last seen? And depending on multiple factors, integrating that also on behavior analytics behind that with conditional access then, and things like our Azure Active Directory integrations, we can then have a real-time risk is associated to the user, but also to the access itself. And then decide if the risk is low enough, if we would like to, for example, allow access in a certain way, or if we want to block the access, apply additional safeguards, like, for example, a complex authentication or MFA. If the user instead, for example, does something different here, and it's still the same user, all the user side safeguards are still okay from our side. But we now see that this kind of access is coming from an anonymous proxy, for example, or something like the Tor network, and it's now seen to log in from Asia. So if we have some kind of anonymous IP address, but we also have an unfamiliar sign-in location for this, and also he is last logged in from the UK 2 hours ago. Now he's accessing from an anonymous IP address somewhere in Asia. How can he come or actually travel so far? We have some kind of an impossible travel scenario as well. We can step in here. So actually the bravery of defend or the identity protection Azure Active Directory steps in here, and we use that in conditional access as a condition. So we can block access or force a password reset, or at least have additional safeguards and also limit the access to certain data, how somebody could extract data from this kind of app, or what the interaction could be like. Up to that, we definitely can force MFA to that. So with that, I would definitely recommend to use modern ways of using, for example, the Authenticator app. And we, as Microsoft internally, are on a way on our journey to a passwordless world with things like, for example, Hello for Business, but definitely also with the Authenticator app itself that has additional ways on how to safeguard that you don't run into any kind of MFA fatigue if you configure it the right way, and so that you will be challenged by any login, for example, to respond with a certain number that is displayed in the session itself. So if you're not in front of the session itself, you can't answer the question anyway. So, and with that, I would like to bring it down to some basic recommendations that we see from our own research. So you can definitely bring down your security posture with very basic things. One of them is definitely enable multi-factor authentication everywhere. And with everywhere, I just mean bring together the worlds of the on-prem Active Directory with what we see in Azure Active Directory, as you brought it together anyway by connecting or syncing some of your identities to a certain degree. Apply the zero trust principles anywhere. Use a modern solution, and there is something built into the operating system, hint, hint, and keep it up to date and protect your data. So meaning actually having a view of what the sensitive data types in your organizations are, and also where your crown jewels lie is definitely a safeguard as well. And with that, I hand it over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you so much, Andre. That was a great overview and understanding of how we need to start looking at identities as a single identity, regardless of if it's in the cloud or on-prem, and really understanding how to protect our hybrid network. So thank you for that. And we'll jump over to my part of the presentation. And really to continue on what Andre mentioned, it's really important that we look at identities holistically. We cannot think of them as siloed identities, one in Azure AD and one in on-prem. It's the same identity. And if we take the example that he mentioned before on the user logging in to Azure, to a business application, and the impossible travel from 2 different countries, Azure AD is very, very good at notifying and understanding this and blocking these types of connections. But that same identity can then be used to log into a file share or to run a script or something on-prem. I want to be able to take that information that Azure AD has found and to share it with Active Directory. But unfortunately, Active Directory and Azure AD, even though they were built by the same organization, they cannot share risk information. They cannot share real-time information in order to make decisions. That is where a solution like Silverfort is working very, very closely with Microsoft to be able to provide that one extra layer of protection across all of my identity providers, regardless of if it's in the cloud or on-prem. So just as a reminder, feel free to use the chat, the Q&A, to ask any questions that you might have. So let's jump into this. First, when we come to customers, this is what a lot of the customers have been saying to us. I already have MFA, I'm protected. And when we ask a few more questions, where do you have MFA? What type of MFA are you using? Well, they say, okay, well, we have our SaaS, our Office 365, obviously coming built in with Azure AD. And in some cases, they even have it for RDP, for their admins to manage their servers. But when we dig a little bit deeper, we understand that the reality of what's going on is that they're very limited into what they're able to do with their current MFA solution. If it's because it's based on agents and those agents are limited in what they're able to see or where they're able to put those agents, There are many scenarios, and we've come across them, and we've seen examples of attacks in the wild. Attackers aren't using RDP. Attackers are not going to go for the gate and try and go through the gate. They're going to go and look for ways around the gate to get into the organization. They're going to use legacy protocols that are much less secure and not encrypted. Andre mentioned LDAP clear text, for example. Believe it or not, organizations are still running clear text protocols for authentication in their network. So why would a customer try and hack, or an attacker, sorry, try and hack SAML or OpenID Connect, which are very strong authentication protocols? They just look at LDAP and get all of the information they need. So we need to be able to protect everything as if it was a modern authentication. And the way attackers are moving is they're using something called lateral movement. That means that they're infecting one machine, one account. And from that one account that they infect, it may be a privileged account, but in many cases, they start with non-privileged accounts. Now they have access to Active Directory, so they can get the username and password for that account. And from there, they're going to start moving around the network and seeing what other accounts they can have and jumping from one machine to another until they've infected all of the machines, until they've found the identity that they want. And from there, it's game over. And this is not just about taking over the on-prem. Remember, our identities are synced, and there's a few examples in the last few months of attacks that have started on-prem and have taken over cloud identities, or vice versa, started in the cloud and moved on-prem. So you don't need to think about identity as cloud and on-prem. You need to think about identity as one single identity. And Andre mentioned it, this is the new perimeter. This is what we need to protect at all costs. And one of the major challenges, specifically when we're talking about Active Directory authentications, is it's very difficult to differentiate between what is a regular user or a legitimate user and what is a bad actor, what is a threat, who is in my network that shouldn't be there. Because the authentications look the same. If I type in my username and password and send it to Active Directory to enter some application, or if an attacker is using a tool like Mimikatz to take a hash, Active Directory will see the authentication in the exact same way. So it's very difficult or near impossible just by looking at the authentications alone to see what is going on. We need to get more context into this, and this is where Silverfort comes in. And as Andre mentioned, from Microsoft, they are specifically saying that in order to protect against these types of attacks, MFA is the key, right? This is not new to anybody. But we also know that the journey to the cloud is not as quick as some of us expected it to be. So according to the latest research, by 2025, which is not that far away actually, less than 3% of medium size and large enterprises will be fully moving their Active Directories to Azure AD. This means that for the foreseeable future, probably in all of our careers, we're still going to live in an environment where Active Directory plays a major role in the identity of an organization. And that's why we have to protect it. So I'm going to pull up two more numbers from a report that Andre already mentioned that I think for me really help to summarize the point. So these two numbers are the key issues impacting cyber resiliency. So we asked, Microsoft asked a large number of security professionals, what is keeping you up at night? What worries you? 98% of them said legacy protocols, so LDAP, NTLM, Kerberos, these very old protocols that are critical to our organization's ability to function, and not having MFA, or MFA is not being mandatory for user accounts. These two things account for most of what is keeping security people up at night. This is what's worrying them. This is where the attackers are going. And this is what we want to be able to address and to protect. So when we look at the security gap, when it comes to identities, there's really two main areas. One, we've talked about a lot already today, is putting MFA in places where it hasn't been before. And not just taking some product, another product off the shelf and throwing it and deploying agents and hoping that will be the solution. That's not the right answer. The right answer is to look at what is already working for the customer. How are they building policies? What is their strategic goal for identity? If their strategic goal is to put all of their identities into Azure AD, then let's make sure that the solution we bring, Silverfort, for example, will integrate that seamlessly. So we have the same user experience, we are building policies using the same tools, in this case, conditional access, and everything is ready for the migration to the cloud as long as it may take. But everything is being built using the Azure AD security stack It makes things just so much easier going forward. You don't have multiple applications that the end users need to use and multiple interfaces. Your security teams are building policies in the same way, and everything is working very well together. So this is from the MFA human user perspective. But there is another large gap as well when it comes to identity protection, which is many, many times overlooked. I'll give you just 2 seconds to maybe think of the answer. The answer is service accounts. Every organization has service accounts, and every organization I've talked to thinks they know how many service accounts they have and what those service accounts are doing. But they are shocked to realize that they're usually about 20 to 30% off of what they thought. So they thought they had 1,000 service accounts, they have 1,300 service accounts. They thought that they were running with low privileges, but they're running with high privileges. It's very difficult for organizations, especially ones that have been around for many, many years, to really understand what is going on. PAM solutions, privileged access management solutions, have tried to answer this problem, not very successfully. Other solutions have been tried, also not very successfully, because all of those solutions rely on the fact that the customer or the organization knows ahead of time what service accounts exist and where they are being used. With Silverfort, we have a different approach, and we will talk about it in just a few minutes. So again, just to kind of summarize the MFA gap around on-premise identities. So one, command line interfaces. We talked about this. Attackers are not using RDP. Attackers are not going through web interfaces. Attackers are going after the infrastructure. They're using built-in Windows tools like PowerShell and PSExec to get around the controls that the organization may have in place. Infrastructure, network drives. Network drives are using very, very old protocols like NTLM and CIFS. This is one of the first places that malware automation tools are going. They're going to try and mount as many network drives as possible in order to encrypt data and jump from one server to the other or one network share to the other. Third-party and homegrown applications. These are applications or servers that I cannot necessarily install any agents, or it's very difficult to make code changes there. I can't do anything to protect it. We need to protect it with a unified approach. The IT infrastructure, and something that is many times overlooked when we talk about MFA, is protecting our databases. Today, because of privacy and regulations, this is a key thing that we must protect, of course, and this is something that attackers are going after. They want to get data out of the company. We need to be able to protect our on-prem databases. They store lots and lots of sensitive information, and we can do this very easily without having to install any agents using the Silverfort solution. And again, about the service accounts, we mentioned this, there is very low visibility. It's unknown what these service accounts are actually doing. We don't know which privileges they're actually using, and in many cases, they're using very high privileges. And in most of the cases, they've been running for a long time. We don't know what they do. We're afraid to make changes. We're afraid to make restarts because we don't know what effect it will have on the business. So these are the blind spots. Now let's take a look at how it works. So if we take a look at the first step, this is what's going on in our on-prem identity infrastructure. We have users, we have service accounts. They are authenticating to Active Directory on-prem in order to authenticate. If it's an end user that wants to access a business application, if it's an admin user that needs to install a patch on a server, whatever it may be, those authentications are going through your main identity solution on-prem. This is going to stay exactly the same. We're not making any changes. So we don't need to make any changes to the servers or the resources, and we don't necessarily need to make any changes to the users as either. What we're going to do is we're going to integrate at the central location, which is the identity store. So once we do our integration with the identity store, we're going to then start to forward authentications to Silverfort in real time. So anytime somebody authenticates, right, you enter username and password or it's SSO, it's going to hit Active Directory. From there, it's going to be forwarded to Silverfort. Once it reaches Silverfort, we need to make a very simple decision based on a lot of different parameters. Are we going to allow it? Are we going to deny it? Or are we going to require some further action? For example, MFA. So we can then decide to forward that request to additional providers to do push MFA, or what we are recommending to our customers is we forward this to Azure AD, and I will show you a demonstration of what this looks like in just a second. We are taking the on-prem authentication and we are passing it over to Azure AD. Specifically in Azure AD, we are passing it over to conditional access. We are saying conditional access here is an authentication that is taking place on-prem. I am giving it to you in a language that you understand because you don't speak LDAP and you don't speak NTLM. So I'm doing a real-time translation. Now I want you to pull in all the information that you have available through conditional access flows. And I want you, Azure AD, to make a decision about what I want to do. The decision can be to allow it based on session tokens or location or device. It can be to block it, but it can also be to do an additional authentication. For example, passwordless or number matching or MFA or, God forbid, SMS or phone call MFA, which obviously we don't want customers to use, but are still using. So we are giving this responsibility over to Azure AD, to conditional access. The benefit of this is that you can have one single location where you are creating all of your policies and all of the decision-making is happening in a central location, regardless of if it's SaaS applications or on-prem applications and authentications. I'll just stop for 1 minute to see if there are any questions. Andre, can you just check the chat and the Q&A because I can't see it on my screen?
Yeah, that's just one question. Is it possible to use a third-party policy engine? I just wonder for what reason, but okay.
There is no third policy. There is only Microsoft in the world. No, I'm just kidding. Can you give me an example of a third-party policy engine that you're maybe thinking about? Whoever asked the question.
Yeah, maybe you can just give an example, maybe from your side then.
So for example, Okta, we know Okta exists, right? So yes, we have integration with Okta as well. So we can use a policy engine from Okta as well. But of course, our recommendation and what we see with most customers is that they are focusing their strategic identity infrastructure to be aligned with Microsoft. It obviously works best with Active Directory as well, but yes, we can use third-party policy engines from other identity providers. Yeah.
So there are two additional questions. So the third-party policy engine that was regarded to was Open Policy Agent or OPA.
Not familiar with that. I will need to check. Okay.
No, and the actual question is if the organization is doing something with Azure Active Directory already, so meaning any kind of MC65 embracement, it doesn't make sense to have to build just another one. So build 5, 7, 10 identity providers. I don't know if that's a reasonable task, but I don't know the complete organization. Definitely, there may be good reasons why. Do we need to register an app in Azure AD? Is another question.
That's a great question. So when we create the policies, so we have two types of policies. We have Azure AD Bridge policies and we have regular Silverfort policies. Regular Silverfort policies will just do push MFA. So you can do push to the Microsoft Authenticator, or you can do push to any one of the apps you see here, including Hyper, which just released an integration with Azure AD, or to FIDO tokens or whatever it may be. But when you create an Azure AD Bridge policy, which means you want the decision of what to do to go through conditional access, when you create this policy, it is automatically creating an enterprise application in Azure AD for you. So you don't need to create it ahead of time. When you create the policy in Silverfort, it will automatically create the enterprise application. And once that application is built in Azure AD, you can then go and assign conditional access to that application. So I hope that that answers your question. Okay. Now let's see how it works. I'll give you just 2 examples or 3 examples of this, and then we'll jump over to service accounts. So let's see here, we have the first example. We'll take this of a user on-prem trying to do a remote PowerShell session. Again, standard PowerShell, nothing fancy. A standard PowerShell command has nothing to do with Silverfort. In this case, they are trying to access a remote server to perform some maintenance. So let's go ahead and we can play this. And let's see what happens. So the user is going to run the command. When the command is run, you see that there is a pop-up window. And from here, we are going to do conditional access. So whatever is defined in conditional access now, that's what's going to happen. In this case, we are seeing number matching. So they need to enter the specific number, which is the preferred method. And once they do that, you will see, I'll just clear the pen. Oh, sorry, it disappeared. Once we do that, we will see that the user was entered into the PowerShell session. I'll just go back so we can see it. They did the number matching, and we are in the PowerShell session. So any type of authentication, again, that is hitting Active Directory, we are able to take it and pass it over to conditional access. In this case, the policy that we had set in conditional access was configured to do number matching for the user, and that's why you saw the push of the number matching. So that's just one example, and we can see just one more example here. In this case, we're going to try and access a shared folder. So you can see that when the shared folder is clicked, it's a standard shared folder, nothing is changing on the side of the server. We see a pop-up in the bottom right-hand corner. When we click the Sign in with Microsoft button, this is again conditional access. If there is a valid token and the policy is configured to allow you to SSO because of a valid token, then you would go straight through. But obviously, in this case, we want to show something a little bit different. So again, redirect it to sign in with Microsoft. You pick your account, enter your password, and again, in this case, we are using number matching. So we enter the number, and we are let into the shared folders. So it's really as simple as that. And the key benefit here, from an end user perspective, is that all of your end users have the exact same user experience. So you don't need to train them, which we all know that the biggest problem with security is relying on the users and not the technology. They're using and they are expecting the same user experience if they are, regardless of where they are logging in. It just makes things simpler and they know what to expect. So all of the social engineering techniques and MFA bombing and all of these things, we can greatly reduce those risks by just having a unified approach to how we are doing MFA across the entire organization. So before I go over to the last point, the last thing that we want to talk about, which is service accounts, I'm just going to see if there are any questions, Andre.
No additional questions so far,
Okay,
as far as I can see.
So let's go over to service accounts. So this is the Silverfort UI, one of the pages in the Silverfort UI. We obviously will not have time to go over everything, but this is specifically focused on service accounts, which I mentioned before is one of the identities that is overlooked when organizations are thinking about their cybersecurity. I will let you know that for those of you that have cyber insurance, this is one of the things that a lot of the cyber insurance providers are now starting to look at when organizations need to renew their insurance. They're starting to ask, how are you protecting your service accounts? Show me a list of all of the service accounts that you have. What are they actually doing and how are you protecting them? So this is becoming more and more important for organizations. So the first thing that we provide here is an overview and some insights, some visibility into how many service accounts I have. What are those service accounts? Which ones are privileged? Which ones are not privileged? And even which ones are using interactive login, meaning that we have a human user and a service that are using the same account, which is a big no-no, and you shouldn't be using it at all. Services should have one account and humans should have their own account. So this is the first step of the visibility. The second step in the visibility is not just providing you a list of the service accounts, but also a list of what this service account is actually doing. So in this case, we have a service account that is in charge of backing up servers, let's say. I can see all of the sources. So this service is running from this list of machines, and it is accessing this list of machines. Now, me as an IT administrator, I know that the backup server is just one server. It's this server, 50.20. So the service should only run from this machine. Perfect. I also know that I only want to back up these 5 machines. Done. More than that, I also know that when I install this backup service, that it is configured to use only Kerberos authentication. Why is this important? Good question, so I will answer it. A lot of attack vectors, what they do is it's called protocol degradation. So instead of trying to attack Kerberos, in Windows, there is the ability to configure that if Kerberos doesn't work, you can fall back to an older protocol, backward compatibility. And NTLM is a lot easier to hack than Kerberos. So what a lot of attackers are doing is they're saying, Kerberos failed, now let me try and authenticate with NTLM, and they're trying to brute force their way into NTLM. If I know that this service is only supposed to run with Kerberos, why will I allow it to run with any other protocol? So what we are building here, what we call it a digital fence or a virtual fence around this service account. So now I know specifically what this service account is supposed to do because I got this information from the business or from the infrastructure team. And now I can configure it to do only what it's supposed to do. And if a developer or an attacker is trying to use this service account outside of what I configured, I can block their access. Even if they are running with domain admin privileges, they will not be able to access. If they need access, they can open a ticket and we can add a new server to this list of what this service account is allowed to do. I don't need to rotate passwords. I don't need to make code changes. I don't need to put anything in a vault. It's all done from here and completely invisible to the applications themselves. And this is what a lot of our customers are using to very, very quickly protect their service accounts in their network. So with that, I am done with my presentation, and we will see if we have any questions because I left exactly 5 minutes for questions.
So feel free to enter your questions into the Q&A function or the chat.
Yeah.
So let us know. So that's one question from my side, Jonathan. So you showed a little example here on how to access an AWS machine, right? And identify that. So how important is that, and what do you see with other customers that they use Azure Active Directory integration with their on-prem Active Directory to actually use third-party apps or third-party clouds that are non-Microsoft in this regard?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we are seeing our customers protect everything. They usually start, the place where they start is with protecting their admin users, their privileged users. So connecting to multi-clouds to reset servers or install patches or update applications, whatever it may be, those are usually the first policies that are being built. And specifically, when we're talking about cloud, a lot of the maintenance that we do to those cloud applications is not done using RDP. It's done using command line tools or APIs. So the legacy ways of protecting those servers by having to install an agent, it's just not reliable. And especially when we are spinning up new machines all the time, until that agent is installed on that machine, it's a hole in my network, right? So if I'm relying on the agent to be deployed and to be deployed correctly, we're in a big mess. And I will say that the exact opposite of that is a lot of customers that have a lot of legacy servers like 2008. You cannot install an agent on Windows 2008 because the vendors are saying we don't support that. For us, that's perfect. I don't care if it's Windows XP or Windows 2008. As long as that authentication is hitting Active Directory, we'll be able to protect access to that server. So it's both sides, both extremes, right? The very old stuff that you can't install agents and the very new stuff that you're using modern tools to manage. Both of those are like the initial policies that we are defining when we come to an organization.
Yeah, there have been 2 questions or 3 at the moment as well. So I can probably read them out and you will answer that are maybe fitting in here well. How do you control who has privileged access into the Silverfort workbench? Do you integrate with IGA systems, for example, Skim 2.0?
Yeah, great question, Michael. So we have what we can configure inside the Silverfort admin console, what you saw, what we call RBA, role-based access, or RBAC, role-based access control. You can define according to groups in Active Directory or Azure AD, who has access to which screens, basically. So if you're a member of the help desk team, or if you're a member of the SOC team, if you're a member of the infrastructure team, each team, when you log in, will see different things and have different permissions. You can have view only or edit or view and edit, whatever it may be. So we have role-based access control built in. We currently don't have integration with IGA, but through the identity provider, the IGA can talk to the identity provider and the identity provider will talk to us. I see the questions now, Andre. Another question, we have the pop-up on the client machine for using MFA. Is it an agent or how is it brought to the user? Great question. So the agent that you saw that popped up, This is used for the flow when we want to use conditional access, because we need the sign in with Microsoft button. It is an agent that is sitting on the machine. I will mention that if you don't want to use the conditional access flow and you want to use just a push MFA to any application, for example, Azure MFA or Okta or Duo or whatever it may be, in that case, the agent on the machine is not required. So the agent on the machine is only required when you are doing what we call bridge to a conditional access. Great question. And another question we have here, what agents or servers must and can be installed to bring Silverfort up and running? Great question. So I'll go back to my architecture slide to answer this question, and I'll share my screen. So let me see, you should be able to see now. Okay, so we need to install an agent on Active Directory. And by the way, we are a Microsoft preferred solution, so we developed this agent together with Microsoft. It doesn't change anything in the Active Directory itself, so no schema changes or anything that would affect Active Directory itself. We are just installing something at the network level on the machine itself. So on the Windows server, we are installing a service. And we are also installing a virtual appliance in your network. Those are the two things that that must be installed. That's it. So I hope that answers your question, Marcos. And I think those are all the questions in the chat.
That's all the questions. So if you have any other question, just feel free to ask. I have another question there. What about the legacy apps that typically are on-prems? And on-prem old apps, like everybody has that. Some apps where they can't really migrate from, and they know that's a pain in the butt somehow. But the question is, how can you integrate that into such a modern authentication world as well?
Yeah. So the only question that we ask the customer is the authentication for that app going to Active Directory? If the answer is yes, we can provide the same level of policies around it. So if it's web, if it's command line, if it's Microsoft thick clients, thin clients, whatever it may be, the only question that we need to know, that we need to ask to know if we will support it is the authentication being done to Active Directory? If the answer is yes, we can protect it. Very simple.
Thanks.
So we are just out of time. I want to be respectful. Thank you very much. Thank you to Microsoft for helping us with this webinar and providing some really important insights. Thank you to everyone for joining. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions, and we would be happy to do some more in-depth demos for anybody that it's relevant for. So thanks again, everyone, and have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you, Andre. Appreciate it. Great session. Bye, everyone.